Another day, another cat mom who survived vet day. Today, I'm so excited. I'm honestly just really excited about the rest of the year's content, but I am going to be talking to you about all my recommendations of books between 100 and 200 pages. There are 22 books on this list, and I own half of them. I genuinely love every single one of these, and I feel so honored to be able to talk about every single one of these all in the same video. I have never been this excited looking at a stack of books and looking at the list of the other ones that I don't have, and I just can't keep the smile off my face. I did want to give a couple honorable mentions to some other books that I did not include on this list. The first grouping is the Hogwarts Library, which includes Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, Quidditch Through the Ages, and The Tales of Beetle the Bard. I figured most people already know those, so I don't really need to go through those, but if you love Harry Potter and you haven't read any of those, then maybe go read them. And then also several Calvin and Hobbes collections were in this size range, and I really don't have any ranking of Calvin and Hobbes. I love them all. So if you've never picked up a Calvin and Hobbes collection, now's maybe the time. This is a continuation of a series I just started last month, where I started with the teensiest books, and I'm going to be giving all my recommendations for different sizes of books. There are a lot of these that I've read during readathons because I enjoy reading a bunch of short books for readathons, but there's also just a fantastic array of genres represented here, and the first one is In the Event This Doesn't Fall Apart by Shannon Lee Berry. I found Shannon because I love Dodie and they're best friends. This is Shannon's first poetry collection. She wrote it throughout the first year she was dating her now husband, which is so cool. They weren't even engaged when she published this, so it's so cool to see in the past few years how their relationship has blossomed, and it's so cool that she has this little document of the beginning of their relationship. So sweet. um, I remember I read this at a time where I was even going through a little bit of heartbreak, and yet it was still such a beautiful collection that I enjoyed reading. So regardless of where you're at with romance and love, it is a very sweet work. It's not just poetry, but it is also prose, so there's a mix throughout. Some of them are poems. Anyone can relate to it. It's not like it's so specific to her that it loses value. The next one I don't have, but is also fantastic, and I just read it last year, and it was honestly very good timing, and that is The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. This is a classic. They're letters, so it is nonfiction, and I'm just going to read the blurb because I think it does a good job giving you an overview of why it's so significant. A national bestseller when it first appeared in 1963, The Fire Next Time galvanized the nation and gave passionate voice to the emerging civil rights movement. At once a powerful evocation of James Baldwin's early life in Harlem and a disturbing examination of the consequences of racial injustice, the book is an intensely personal and provocative document. It consists of 2 letters written on the occasion of the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, that exhort Americans, both black and white, to attack the terrible legacy of racism. Described by the New York Times Book Review as sermon, ultimatum, confession, deposition, testament, and chronicle, as all presented in searing, brilliant prose, The Fire Next Time stands as a classic of our literature, and I'd had this on my list for a while. This is my first James Baldwin. Fantastic intro for me. And it was so cutting. I read it right after the elections, and the way it just pierced through all of the prejudice and culture war and lies that the current climate has been through was phenomenal, because it's not just about racism, but it's also about how Christians can be misusing scripture. Anyone and everyone should read this, whether you're a Christian, whether you're not a Christian, and obviously in light of how relevant all of these types of conversations are, it's so beautiful to see James Baldwin cut through the noise and say, I understand and I see you, and I'm verbalizing for you because I see you in the tension, in the pain, in the nuance and the complexity of humanity. The third book is very different, but very wonderful, and that is Love That Dog by Sharon Creech. Love That Dog is specifically about a boy working on his writing throughout the book, and his dog recently passed. He's also writing a lot to his favorite author, who is Walter Dean Myers. And so it's a love of literature, it's a love of learning and a celebration of education, but it's also a love for animals and working through difficult emotions and grief. And it's really, really beautiful. And it's very simple and straightforward because it is a kid's book, but it is certainly worth the read even as an adult. The next one is my favorite play, and that is All My Sons by Arthur Miller. Fun fact, 21 Pilots got their band name from this play. In Joe and Kate Keller's family garden, an apple tree, a memorial to their son Larry, lost in the Second World War, has been torn down by a storm. But his loss is not the only part of the family's past they can't put behind them. Not everybody's forgotten the court case that put Joe's partner in jail, or the cracked engine heads his factory produced, which caused it and dropped 21 pilots out of the sky. All My Sons is a moving, powerful drama of the ethics of profiteering and family in the first great play from one of the finest playwrights of the 20th century. I do have 3 podcasts where I analyzed the entire play through book club discussion. So I did Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. You can find that on my podcast, anywhere you listen to podcasts. My podcast is called Entrench, and I will actually link Act 1 below if anyone is interested in checking those out. The next one was a required read in college, and I'm so grateful because it was fantastic, and that is Night by Elie Wiesel. And this is an autobiography, and I'll also read you the blurb. Born in the town of Sighet, Transylvania, Elie Wiesel was a teenager when he and his family were taken from their home in 1944 to the Auschwitz concentration camp and then to Buchenwald. Night is a terrifying record of Elie Wiesel's memories of the death of his family, the death of his own innocence, and his despair as a deeply observant Jew confronting the absolute evil of man. I remember being flabbergasted reading this because it was so emotive and so objective, despite being an autobiography and despite the amount of trauma that was experienced. The way he wrote it, just the fact that he wrote it, still astounds me. That he was willing to put himself there once more, and maybe even several times, because he probably had to revise this as well. But it's so to the point in a way that pierces you, and that's also what I love about books that are this small, is there's no fluff. They get right to the point and they do it really effectively. And he did such a good job of taking 120 pages and giving you comprehensive, nauseous feeling of what it was like to be at a concentration camp and to suffer through the absolute dehumanization and trauma of going through something like that. The next 3 I ended up grouping together because they're all by the same author, but they are each fantastic in their own right, which is why I wanted to share all of them and not just 1 or even 2 of them. So the first one is probably the most popular, and that is Letters to a Young Poet by Rainier Maria Rilke. This is my favorite poet of all time, but he also writes other types of books. And so this book is letters, self-explanatory, but he writes to various poets, or maybe I think it's actually just one poet throughout the entire thing. And I did read this one for a readathon, and is definitely one that I would absolutely easily reread again. It's also, of course, super small and easy to reread. But this is for people who love poetry, people who write poetry and want encouragement and meditation on the art form itself. It's super heady. So if that's not your thing, if you're not into poetry or not sure if you're into poetry, it's maybe less so for you. But if you love the craft of writing, especially poetry, and or you're also just an artist of any kind and want some encouragement, he does a fantastic job. This is nonfiction letters, which he's done a few times. As you might have seen, he had a different letter compilation in my previous video. But this one is also probably the most famous, and for good reason. It's straight to the heart of an artist in a way that we all need assurance of sometimes. The next one is a group of short stories called Stories of God, and I actually, the only reason I even picked this up was because my mother owned it from a long, long time ago, and I found it and knew that I wanted to read his work. I think this is actually the first of his work that I ever read, and easy 5 stars. I was like, this is such a blessing that I got to read something I wouldn't have read otherwise if my mother did not have it, because I loved it. I would have passed it by otherwise, which is wild, and which is now why I want to read virtually everything by him. But this one is basically him finding ways to explain God and spirituality to children. And so the different ways that he does throughout these like short stories are very imaginative, they're very creative, they're very distinct, and he uses each little story to meditate on a different concept. And I'm biased because I am a spiritual person myself, so I was just very intrigued and enamored by it. Um, if you're not one to meditate on spirituality, it's probably less so going to be for you. But yeah, so he was only, according to this blurb, 23 at the time of composition. Um, but these stories were inspired by a trip to Russia the young poet had made the year previously. It said that the vastness of the Russian landscape and the profound spirituality he perceived in the simple people he met led him to an experience of finding God in all things, and to the conviction that God seeks to be known by us as passionately as we might seek to know God. I just really liked how he wanted to be creative about explaining something that um, has been explained by so many people over such a long time. It was just very imaginatively inspiring to take things that I'm very familiar with, knowledge I've had for a long time, and still find new ways to explain it. I just thought it was a cool creativity exercise to read this work, and that's why it really stuck with me. And then the third work of his I wanted to include on here is a poetry collection, and that is Sonnets to Orpheus. These I actually read on my birthday this year. I had been wanting to read this collection for a while and was just so happy that it ended up being as wonderful as I had hoped it to be. This, of course, is for people who do enjoy reading poetry. He can be a little more cerebral in his poetry, so that's what you can expect from his poetry. Here's one of the poems that I like, because I like to tab all my favorites. We are the achievers, but this march of time, consider it a trifle among whatever abides. All that hastens will soon be gone, for what lingers first consecrates us. Boys, oh, don't throw your courage into speed, into the attempt to fly. Everything is at rest, darkness and bright, blossom and book. Probably biased because he mentioned a book. The next one is such a fun and beautiful illustrated book, and that is The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse by Charlie Mackesy. This is one of those beautiful moments that I love in children's literature where very adult, complex emotions are distilled simply for children to wade through and try to grapple with. And there's something so emotional to me about explaining the trials of life in very simple words. Um, because even when we want to protect children as much as we can, we can't help that the world is broken, and sometimes it's worth talking through as well to let children know that the world is broken and that that can include their lives, even though we don't want it to, like ever. But yes, this was a very wholesome, warms your heart in the middle of winter read, um, while covering heavier topics. It's more so like encouraging people through heaviness, than just like leaving you in the heaviness, if that makes sense. Yeah, the animals help depict different parts of emotions and humanity as well, and it was it was a delight. The next one is another poetry collection. This is by a woman that I am privileged to know personally, and that is Lauren De Camillo. This is called For Eleanor. And to put it simply, this is an incredibly powerful poetry collection about what it is like to go through a miscarriage. Um, I don't think we talk about miscarriages in art enough, and this is solely dedicated to the journey and the stages of grief with miscarriage. I felt that certain poems, she put me exactly where she was in a way that you can't do anything but cry. Um, and so, surely, if you are at all familiar or know someone who is at all familiar with the pain of miscarriage, it is very accurately depicted here. And I would highly suggest that you pick it up or purchase it for them, because this needs the platform. And now it has the platform, and it's a really cool person, with a beautiful voice that is representing a lot of hurting people. So I would highly recommend. And even if you're not super into poetry, it's very easy language, very accessible, and it's a very important topic to be able to hand people and say, hey, I have something that will make you feel validated. The next one is probably the biggest classic on this list, and that is Animal Farm by George Orwell. I never actually had to read this in school, which I feel like is shocking, but I ended up picking it up a couple years ago of my own accord during a readathon, surprise, surprise, and first of all, was surprised by how fast I flew through it. It was so easy to read, and I think I literally read it in one sitting. I didn't get up until I was done. And of course, everyone loves the political, governmental themes in Animal Farm, but it was very captivating in how it meditated on systems and how control is wielded and then believed in and abided by with other beings. For me, yeah, it more so was just like a fascinating overview of control and what that looks like and how it's cultivated. And for me, it's much more like psychology focused, but I know other people love it for the political and social focus. But overall, it's, we all have to deal with like systems of control in one way or another throughout our lives. So it's definitely a very universal narrative to get into. Basically, it's about a farm, and the animals start taking over because they want to be free from the people who've owned them, but then they end up making their own hierarchical structure anyway. And some of the animals start saying they're better than the other animals, etc., etc. So it's kind of a even in freedom, do we really have freedom from structures? Um, and the question of like, will we just devolve back into different structures again? And is freedom ever even really possible in that way? A lot of good questions, good meditations, and the it's very kind of eerie but fascinating at the same time to see how quickly new control and new hierarchy is put in place as soon as the old one is gone. It's very fascinating, and the ending is also like mind blown for full circle moments. The next one is also more of a classic, and that is The Broken Wings by Khalil Gibran. And I'm going to pull up the blurb for this one. This for me was a very emotive read, a very timely read of dwelling on heartbreak. And yeah, so it says a tender tale set in Beirut tells of first love between a youth and a young girl named Selma, who is promised in marriage to another man. But it's kind of also just a lot of heady meditations on love and heartbreak, especially, and just the process of wading through those emotions. I find when I need to unnumb myself and continue processing through an emotion, sometimes picking up a novel like this is very useful in helping me get unstuck in my negative emotions so that I can then have the freedom to go back to the fluffy books or what have you. So I like to use books like this as an emotional processing tool. I think they're very good at that. I think they're very useful. I do not believe in avoidance. I only know distraction from avoidance, so I will never promote avoidance. And so if you need to continue processing some hard emotions, hate to say it, but also love to say it, it's time to pick up The Broken Wings, maybe. The next one is the coolest short story collection I've ever read that I like to recommend people, and that is Hybrid Creatures by Matthew Baker. I am honored that this is also an alumna from my alma mater. Everyone knows Emily Henry. Most people don't know Matthew Baker, but Matthew Baker is phenomenal. These stories are so smart because they take different tools and tell a story. So if you want something super experimental, so the first story uses computer code to tell the story. It's not solely computer code, but it enhances the story by using this jargon language. The second story uses math. It's called The Golden Mean. The third story uses music and musical movements, which is so cool. And then the fourth story is proof of the century, so it's using proof and a different kind of math. And I got to hear him read part of the music story, which I'm very biased. That's my favorite, just because it's the jargon that I understand the best. But it's such a cool reminder that when you want to read or write, you can use literally anything and everything that you've ever learned in your life, and it can make a story. And he does it so well because he proves how these specific modes of being and communicating can enhance the written word and make a point that just using the written word alone could not. And I also am just very biased in thinking that it's really cool when arts are combined. I love multimedia. I love trying new ways of writing. I think it's the coolest and the most memorable things ever. And this was an easy 5 stars. The next one is When the Emperor Was Divine by Julie Atsuka. Here is the blurb. Julie Atsuka's commanding debut is crazy. This is phenomenal. Paints a portrait of the Japanese internment camps unlike any we have ever seen. With crystalline intensity and precision, Atsuka uses a single family to evoke the deracination, both physical and emotional, of a generation of Japanese Americans. In 5 chapters, each flawlessly executed from a different point of view, the mother receiving the order to evacuate, the daughter on the long train ride to the camp, the son in the desert encampment, the family's return to their home, and the bitter release of the father after more than 4 years in captivity, she has created a small tour de force, a novel of unrelenting economy and suppressed emotion. Spare, intimate, arrestingly understated, When the Emperor Was Divine is a haunting evocation of a family in wartime and an unmistakably resonant lesson for our times. It heralds the arrival of a singularly gifted new novelist, and there's really not anything else more that I can say. It was just as piercing, if not more, as Night by Elie Wiesel. Both such important experiences to be able to put ourselves in the shoes of these people so that we can learn from the world's tragedies. These types of books are the perfect way to have empathy, especially if you're not someone who understands or has much empathy. These books will force you to be empathetic. And I think that is crucial to being a part of the human race and a part of the planet that we are on. So there are also 3 of my all-time favorite books on this list, and it makes the stack wonderful, which is a very biased thing to say. The first one is Harold and Maude by Colin Higgins. So this is actually my favorite movie, and then I found out it originally was in the written word before they produced the movie. So of course I had to buy it. Harold and Maude is about Harold and Maude. Harold is a 20-year-old man who is very depressed and who's constantly faking his suicide blatantly in front of his mother, and she could not care less. And eventually he meets Maude at one of their favorite shared activities, which is attending funerals of people they don't know. And Maude is an 80-year-old woman who has the greatest amount of joy and zeal for life. And it's simultaneously a coming of age for Harold, but it's also a meditation on working through mental health. But it's also an ode to silver linings and how they're always possible. And it's also just a cult classic. It's also very, very humorous. You have to love dark humor and deadpan humor, especially. There are a couple scenes in here that were not in the movie, so it was nice to have that teeny bit of extra information. But overall, this is like 98% the same story as the movie. So, of course, I love it, but also if you'd rather watch the movie, feel free. Some people will think the focus of this story is something it's not. But I think ultimately the people who will like the story, because I know not everyone will, are people who are not afraid to not take anything seriously, and people who are tired of being put together, people who are tired of following rules, people who are tired of being conventional. This is for people who just need a breath of fresh air with unconventionality and thinking outside of the box. So the next two are 2 books in the same series. I think you can maybe also find this as 1 book instead of 2, but I read them as 2 separate parts, and that is Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. Yes, so there's a 1 and a 2. And it is a graphic novel, which I feel like people either love graphic novels or they've never really touched them. But they're basically novels, but entirely with images. This is actually also an autobiography, and it is the story of her life in Tehran from 6 to 14. So the part 1 is just girlhood, and part 2 is womanhood, basically. And it's growing up through the Shah regime, the Islamic Revolution, and the effects of war with Iraq. It's another one of these, like, these autobiographies just like gut punch me, because even whilst people are going through horrors, they find ways to still have pockets of normalcy and even pockets of humor and lightheartedness. And it just boggles my mind. But I suppose, like, when you are stuck in terrible situations, like, you have to, otherwise you will just crumble. It's also just a celebration that change is always possible. And the next one is a second poetry collection by a woman that I also know personally, and that is Undoing, a Work of Fiction by Elizabeth Cooper. This is broken into 4 parts: a shattering, a fear, a blade, intermission, a pause, and a renewing. And it's also, by the tears on the front, it's also working through some heartbreak. And to me, one of the coolest parts is the final section, a renewing, because there's a lot of grief for herself, for the pain that she endured in relationships, but then there's also the hope in her spirituality and her faith that she ends up clinging to in the end, that um, gives her this full circle moment of finding purpose despite the parts of her life story she wishes maybe didn't exist, or didn't unravel in the ways in which they did. And so it's a cool, empowering moment where she's able to process through her story, but then also in the end, ultimately reclaim her story. And I feel like you can kind of see that in the title of this. But it's an honor to be able to see her really redemptive story of her own life and the way that she processed through that. The next one is the most recent one that I read. I listened to this one, and that is one of my favorite Christian speakers. That is Jackie Hill Perry. Her book, Holier Than Thou: How God's Holiness Helps Us Trust Him. And basically, this book is Jackie meditating on God's holiness, what it means for God to be holy, and how ultimately it is impossible for God to sin against us. It is so easy for us to confuse human pain with thinking that is how God will act toward us as well. And so it is this validation of pain that you have suffered from humanity. Especially many people I know have suffered from the church itself and have trauma and huge wounds and have left the church because of church pain. Versus you take that pain, you validate it, you stare at it, then you map onto it God's inability to act that way. And because of that, we can trust Him. We can know that He is a safe haven, no matter how many people hurt us. And even in our pain with people, we can take that to Him and know that He will always love us, protect us, and look out for us. And ultimately always have goodness in mind, because that is, among many other attributes, part of his character. It was very cathartic as someone who has been traumatized by multiple people, and has gone through so much rejection and unlearned people pleasing and had to put up boundaries and had relationships change because of those various things. To really believe and ruminate on the fact that God literally, like, cannot be that way, despite the amount of pain I've been through. And it was so healing to genuinely know and meditate with Jackie on the fact that He can't be that way. He never will be that way. And that's why, for me and for other Christians, He's the rock, because He's not all of these things that humanity is. And it's really hard for our brains to grasp, because all we know visually is human interaction. But yet He goes beyond. It's just the craziest, most mind-blowing thing. but it really does set you free when you actually meditate on what his character is and how it's so consistent throughout the Bible. The next one is also a little graphic novel, and it's called Everything is Okay by Debbie Tung. And this is very mental health heavy. So it's basically the author herself working through therapy to work through her anxiety and her depression and how she rewired and worked on her cognitive behavior. CBT has also done wonders for me. I know it's not everyone's preferred modality, but it felt almost exactly like me and my therapist. So this was probably the most biased one where I just highly identified with the main character throughout this graphic novel. But it is very cathartic and very validating for anyone who suffers with anxiety, depression, or both. So if you want something short and sweet that will make you feel seen, give it a go. And then we're already to the final two. Such a bummer because these are just so fun to talk about. But the final two are my other all-time favorites. So the first one is going to be the one a lot more people are familiar with. Many of you maybe even read it in school, and that is The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. I just reread this year for writing inspiration, and I love rereading my all-time favorites because they strike me a little bit different every single time. This is about Pony Boy and his family and his brothers, and also his friends that are basically his family as well, through the neighborhood gangs. And it's about kids growing up being in different social classes. So he's part of the more poor, greaser side of town, whereas the socias, short for socials, are the more popular kids who have a lot more wealth and are on the different side of town. And so it's about prejudice with classism. It's also about violence, and just working through, having to grow up in a childhood with violence. And it's also entirely about brotherhood and entirely about friendship. What I really liked is this is one of those instances where the character is writing the book himself to turn it in for a grade. But what I really liked is that he basically decided like what he wants to use his writing for is for remembrance of what is valuable to him. And that is something that I also value writing for. So it was a joy to reread this and to resonate with why he's even writing this story to begin with. There's just something so beautiful about brotherhood and about vulnerability within brotherhood, and working through conflict, working through life's roller coaster together, and not being afraid to be messy, and also just very fiercely protect one another. It's really beautiful. Stay golden. And then last but not least, I guess there's kind of a third of these are related to artistry somehow, but this is another nonfiction, Failing Up: How to Take Risks, Aim Higher, and Never Stop Learning by Leslie Odom Jr. This man was Aaron Burr in the original Hamilton cast. He's also done other things on the stage, and he has also been a fantastic jazz musician as well, with a fantastic Christmas album as well. And this is his journey of getting to where he was ultimately with Hamilton, which, like many people my age, was my craze throughout college. With like the biggest fandom I was in college was probably Hamilton. But what I really resonated with about his creative story is that his parents and his loved ones were a little unsure and hesitant with what he was wanting to do, and yet he was fiercely loyal to his own art and his own creative desires, and he overcame the doubts of his loved ones for the sake of belief in art and belief in the value of art, and wanting to be a part of the value of art. And it's definitely one that I would love to reread, as I would enjoy to reread any of my all-time favorites. But I read it right before I graduated college, so it was very timely and emotive because of that, because of the idea that like you won't necessarily have it all figured out, but you should press on anyway. Um, there's there's a lot of value in failure. It's not just about succeeding all the time, which is a huge lie that especially hustle culture and social media can teach you. But the reality is, we can also learn so much from our failures and also end up where we're actually supposed to be because of things that fall through or don't happen how we thought they would. Um, yeah, it's about having an open mind with anything and everything that you're going through artistically, and just trusting that just like art is an ever changing process, there's never like one final ending to art. The same is true of finding your way as an artist. So to all of my artists out there, keep going. um, Art is so important, as I've shown my enthusiasm for all of these books. And this is the type of stuff that makes people enthusiastic and it makes the world go round. And so keep trusting that art is important, because it is. And even now, when things are very political, art is still just as important. I hope those were intriguing, and I hope there's a lot in that stack that piqued your interest, because there was a decent variety. Um, I hope you find something good that you'd never even heard of before. Let me know if there's any that particularly stuck out to you, because I would love to convince you even more if I have to. But also let me know if there's any other books that you love that are between 100 and 200 pages, because it's such a sweet spot, clearly, of books that I tend to love so much, because um, to write something powerful but succinct is such a valuable skill, in my opinion. And that's what I love about all of these. It doesn't have to be long to be powerful. So, with that being said, I will be on my way, and I hope you guys have a good day, evening, afternoon, and I will talk to you soon.